Did you know that Brazil was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery? This is not just a forgotten date in history books, it is a dark truth marked by blood, exploitation, and silence. While other nations were already moving toward freedom, here millions were still suffering in chains. But why did Brazil take so long? And what was the price of this delay? Today, you will discover the hidden backstage of abolition and how its scars still shape our society. The history of slavery in Brazil did not begin suddenly. It was built little by little, starting with the arrival of the Portuguese colonizers in the 16th century. The system of slavery was already a known reality in the world, but here it reached gigantic proportions. At first, the Portuguese tried to enslave the indigenous peoples, imposing forced labor on plantations and construction sites. But indigenous resistance, the diseases brought from Europe, and the difficulty of maintaining this system on a large scale led the Crown to seek another solution: the importation of enslaved Africans. The transatlantic trafficking of people was the gear that fueled centuries of wealth for the colonizers and pain for millions of Africans. Men, women, and children were captured in their villages, crammed into slave ships, and brought to Brazil in inhumane conditions. Many died before arriving. Those who survived were sold as merchandise and destined for sugar plantations, gold mines, or domestic service. This dynamic turned Brazil into one of the largest receivers of enslaved Africans in the entire world, with numbers surpassing more than 4 million people over more than 3 centuries. During the colonial period, sugar was the great driver of the economy, sustained entirely by enslaved labor. Every piece of cultivated land represented not only profit for the masters, but also the suffering of hundreds of captives. Slavery became not only an economic system, but also a social structure. Being enslaved in Brazil was not only about working for free under the whip, it was about living under a regime of dehumanization, where men and women were treated as objects with no right to family, identity, or freedom. Over time, gold mining in Minas Gerais and later the coffee cycle in the 19th century intensified this dependence even more. The economic and political elite was directly tied to slavery, which made any discussion about ending this system a threat to the heart of colonial and imperial Brazilian society. Meanwhile, on the global stage, other countries were already beginning to rethink their models. England, France, Haiti, the United States, and several nations gradually abolished enslaved labor. Brazil, however, resisted. This resistance was not just stubbornness. It was rooted in 3 main factors: economic dependence, the political power of the slaveholding elites, and a structural racism that justified the idea that black people were inferior and destined for forced labor. These elements created such a strong web that it delayed any real movement toward freedom. It is important to highlight that slavery in Brazil was the longest in modern history. While many countries were already moving toward abolition since the late 18th century, here it extended until 1888. It lasted for more than 300 years. A system that shaped the economy, culture, and above all, the inequality that remains to this day. Slavery was not just a legal institution, it was a pillar of Brazilian society. With every passing decade, the number of enslaved people grew, and the contrast with other nations became increasingly visible. This delay, as we will see later, was not a simple historical detail, but a deliberate choice of the elites, who preferred to prolong their power and wealth even at the cost of human dignity. Thus, by understanding the historical context, we realize that slavery in Brazil was not an accident along the way. It was a planned, defended, and prolonged construction. And this is the starting point to understand why Brazil would become the last country in the West to officially abolish this perverse system. If at the beginning slavery was justified by the need for labor, over time it consolidated as the foundation of the national economy. In the next chapter, we will understand how the economic strength of the slave system became the main reason for its maintenance, and how the profit of a few cost the freedom of millions. Slavery was not just a system of forced labor. It was the gear that sustained the Brazilian economy for centuries. To understand why Brazil took so long to abolish this model, we need to look at the economic impact it represented. The country grew and consolidated on the international stage thanks to the sweat, blood, and lives of millions of enslaved people. In the 16th and 17th centuries, sugar was the great driver of the economy. Cultivation in the hereditary captaincies and in the sugar mills spread along the northeastern coast demanded an intense, continuous, and cheap labor force, something the colonizers found in African slavery. This system not only generated exorbitant profits for the elite, but also placed Brazil at the center of Atlantic trade. The sugar mill owners, enriched by exports, became the dominant elite of colonial society. With the discovery of gold in Minas Gerais in the 18th century, the demand for enslaved labor increased even more. In the mines, work was brutal, unhealthy, and deadly. Men, women, and even children were forced to extract as much wealth as possible in precarious conditions, often without seeing the sunlight for days. Brazilian gold financed the Portuguese crown and fed Europe's luxury, while the workers remained in chains with no prospect of freedom. By the 19th century, coffee had taken on the economic spotlight. The plantations in the Paraíba Valley and later in western São Paulo turned coffee into Brazil's main export product. Once again, those sustaining this cycle were the enslaved, who worked from sunrise to sunset on massive farms, under constant surveillance and cruel punishments. Coffee consolidated the wealth of the agrarian elite and gave Brazil a strategic position in international trade. This economic dependence explains much of the resistance to abolition. For the elite, slavery was not just convenient, it was indispensable. Abolishing it meant giving up the system that sustained fortunes, political power, and social influence. Many masters saw the freedom of the captives as a direct threat to their stability and the future of their businesses. This vision gained strength in aristocratic salons, political assemblies, and even in newspapers that defended the maintenance of order. Another important aspect is that slavery generated a parallel economy of human trade. The trafficking of Africans, and later the internal trafficking of enslaved people within Brazil, moved fortunes. People were bought and sold like commodities, with prices varying according to age, physical strength, or ability for certain types of work. This trade turned human lives into statistics, reinforcing the cruel logic that slavery was, above all, profitable. And it was not only in the countryside that the enslaved were exploited. In the cities, they worked as porters, artisans, street vendors, and even specialized professionals, always delivering part or all of the fruits of their labor to their masters. In this way, slavery infiltrated all levels of the economy, shaping not only the productive system, but also urban and rural ways of life. This scenario explains why abolition was constantly delayed. Even when international pressures grew and public opinion began to change, the elite resisted. They feared losing the base of their wealth and believed that without slavery, Brazil would plunge into economic chaos. This slave-holding mentality lasted until the very last days of the Golden Law, always sustained by the idea that the freedom of black people would mean the ruin of the country. But behind all this economic logic, there was a reality that the numbers hid. Human suffering. Every sack of coffee exported, every gram of gold sent to Europe, and every ton of sugar sold was the result of the forced labor of millions of people who were never rewarded. The wealth of a few was built upon the misery of many. This contradiction between the profit of the elite and the suffering of the enslaved is essential to understand the delay of abolition. It was not about ignorance or chance. It was a conscious choice. Maintaining slavery meant maintaining power. However, this machinery began to be questioned. While Brazil clung to the slave system, the world around it was already transforming. External pressures, mainly from England, and internal movements began to destabilize this structure. In the next chapter, we will understand how these international pressures and internal resistances exposed the contradictions of a country that insisted on keeping itself chained to the past. While Brazil became increasingly dependent on slavery, the international scenario was already heading in another direction. Since the end of the 18th century, slavery had been questioned in different parts of the world. The Haitian Revolution in 1804 had shown that an enslaved people could rise against their oppressors and conquer freedom, generating fear in all colonial elites. In the United States, the Civil War between 1861 and 1865 culminated with the abolition of slavery in 1863. In England, the pressure against the slave trade was intensifying, driven both by humanitarian and economic interests. For London, the slave trade was not just a moral problem, it was also a strategic issue. By abolishing slavery in its colonies, England sought to weaken competing economies that still depended on it. Brazil, which had become the largest receiver of enslaved Africans, was a direct target of these pressures. The Aberdeen Act of 1845 gave the British the right to seize Brazilian slave ships on the high seas. It was a deep blow that exposed the fragility of the empire before the English power. In response, Brazil approved the Eusebio de Queiroz Law in 1850, which officially prohibited the transatlantic slave trade. However, the practice continued clandestinely for years, fueled by the greed of masters and traders. It was a game of interests. The country formally yielded to international pressures, but maintained in practice its slaveholding structure. This double movement showed how Brazil tried to balance itself between appearing civilized to the world and preserving backwardness at home. But the pressures did not come only from outside. Within the country itself, signs of wear in the system emerged. The free population began to organize around abolitionist ideas. Intellectuals, journalists, and political groups started a campaign increasingly intense for freedom. The urban press, especially in cities like Rio de Janeiro, Recife, and São Paulo, was fundamental in spreading discourses against slavery. Pamphlets, articles, and public debates ignited the social discussion. In addition, there was a silent and powerful resistance, that of the enslaved themselves. Quilombos emerged in different regions, serving as refugees and symbols of freedom. Revolts and escapes became more frequent, challenging the structure of slave-holding power. This resistance showed that slavery was not a stable system, but a ticking time bomb ready to explode. For every plantation, every sugar mill, and every field, there was always the risk of insurrection. Another important point was the entry of liberal and republican ideas, influenced by European movements. Young students, many of them from the elite, began to openly defend the abolitionist cause, creating abolitionist societies and clubs. They organized events, helped enslaved people escape, and pressured the government for changes. This new generation would become a link between popular pressures and political power. Even so, the resistance of the elite was fierce. Large landowners, slaveholders, held seats in parliament and had direct influence on the government. For them, abolition meant the end of their wealth and of the economic model that sustained the country. Thus, the debate on slavery dragged on amid timid laws, such as the Free Womb Law of 1871 and the Sexagenarian Law of 1885, which granted freedom only partially and gradually. These measures were, in practice, attempts to prolong the system's existence as much as possible. What we see in this period is a Brazil cornered, On one side, growing international pressures, coming mainly from England, which demanded the end of the trade and slavery. On the other, an internal elite resistant, willing to sacrifice any progress in the name of maintaining its privileges. In the middle, the enslaved population, which continued to resist in every possible way, and a civil society that, little by little, began to demand more radical changes. This conflict between external and internal pressures created a scenario of constant tension. The Brazilian Empire could no longer ignore the winds of change. Slavery became increasingly indefensible before the world and more unsustainable within the country itself. The Brazilian delay began to be seen not as a sign of strength, but as a mark of shame and backwardness. But if on one side there were external pressures and growing social movements, on the other there existed the flame of the most powerful internal resistance of all, that of the enslaved themselves. In the next chapter, we will dive into the struggle and courage of those who did not passively accept the chains and who wrote, with blood and hope, the path to freedom. To speak about slavery in Brazil without highlighting the resistance of the enslaved themselves would be to tell only half of the story. For more than 3 centuries, African men and women and their descendants did not passively accept the chains imposed upon them. They resisted in multiple ways, fleeing, forming communities, rebelling, and even silently sabotaging the system that oppressed them. This resistance was one of the most powerful forces that pushed Brazilian society toward abolition. Among the strongest symbols of this struggle were the quilombos. These were communities formed by escaped enslaved people, spread throughout the Brazilian territory. Some were small groups hidden in hard-to-reach areas. Others, like the famous Quilombo of Palmares, became true free territories with social, economic, and military structures. Palmares, in the current state of Alagoas, resisted for almost 1 century, sheltering thousands of people and directly challenging colonial power. Its destruction did not erase the example that it was possible to live outside the chains, inspiring new escapes and rebellions. In addition to the Quilombos, there were organized revolts that marked history. The Malay Revolt in 1835, led by enslaved Muslims in Salvador, is an emblematic example. Highly organized, with strategic planning and military discipline, it showed that the enslaved were not passive victims, but conscious actors in their fight for freedom. Despite being violently repressed, the revolt made clear that slavery was unsustainable and that resistance was a permanent reality. But not all resistance occurred openly. Many enslaved people used individual escape as a way to break the system. Each person who escaped represented an economic blow to the master and an act of self-affirmation of dignity. Others practiced subtle forms of resistance, working less than expected, sabotaging tools, delaying harvests, or preserving their cultural and religious traditions as a way to keep their identity alive. Resistance also manifested in the preservation of African memory and culture. Dances, music, languages, and religions crossed the Atlantic and remained alive, even amid attempts of erasure. Capoeira, for example, was born as a mixture of fight and dance, disguised to avoid punishment, but serving as training for defense in escapes and confrontations. Religion, in turn, became a spiritual refuge, a link with ancestry, and a source of strength to endure pain. Enslaved women played a fundamental role in this process. Many organized escapes, hid fugitives, or transmitted cultural and spiritual knowledge to new generations. They were also protagonists of silent resistance, protecting children, defying abuse, or using words as weapons in court petitions to win freedom. Their stories reveal that the struggle was not limited to the battlefield, but also took place inside the slave quarters, in the courts, and in the homes. These acts of resistance gradually undermined the idea that slavery was an unbreakable system. Each escape, each quilombo, and each revolt showed society that maintaining the chains had a high price, the constant fear of rebellions. For the masters, it meant living always under tension. For the state, it meant facing political and military crises. And for the elite, it meant living with the certainty that their wealth was constantly under threat. Therefore, when we speak about the end of slavery in Brazil, we cannot attribute it only to laws and external pressures. It was also the direct result of the struggle of the enslaved themselves, who never accepted the imposed condition. Resistance was, ultimately, the invisible engine that accelerated the abolitionist process. But resistance was not only in the slave quarters and quilombos. It also echoed in the streets of the cities, in the newspapers, in associations, and in the voices of intellectuals and abolitionists who decided to challenge the established order. In the next chapter, we will see how social movements and the press of the time became decisive allies in the fight against slavery. If the resistance of the enslaved shook the structures of the system from within, social movements and the urban press did the same from the outside. In the 19th century, especially in the decades leading up to abolition, organizations, clubs, newspapers, and leaders emerged that began to mobilize public opinion against slavery. This external front was essential to pressure the state and corner the slaveholding elite, showing that slavery was not only a moral problem, but also a political and social issue that compromised the future of the country. The first initiatives came from groups of intellectuals and students influenced by Enlightenment, liberal, and Republican ideas. Inspired by European revolutions and the winds of modernity blowing from abroad, they began to form abolitionist associations in different cities. University students, lawyers, and journalists joined in clubs, organized public debates, and raised funds to buy the freedom of enslaved people. These actions, although limited in scope, helped create an environment increasingly favorable to the discourse of freedom. The press played a central role in this process. Newspapers such as O Abolicionista, Gazeta da Tarde, and other periodicals dedicated to the cause of freedom spread across the country. Fiery articles denounced the horrors of slavery, published stories of fugitives, and called the population to mobilize. These texts were read in cafes, squares, and even in popular gatherings, expanding the reach of the message. The printed word became a powerful weapon against the slave system, capable of moving hearts and minds. In addition, music, theater, and literature also embraced the cause. Plays portrayed the suffering of the enslaved and provoked deep reflections in the audience. Writers and poets began to denounce the hypocrisy of a society that called itself civilized while keeping millions in captivity. The abolitionist discourse was no longer just political, it became cultural, crossing different layers of the population. The abolitionist campaigns also had a practical side. Many groups organized real support networks for escapes, hiding enslaved people in safe houses and helping them flee to freer regions. This movement became known as the hunt for escaped captives by the police, but also as the Freedom Network for those who risked their lives to save others. Abolition ceased to be only a distant idea. It became concrete action in everyday life. As the movement gained strength, entire cities began to mobilize. In some regions, such as Ceará, popular pressure was so intense that slavery ended locally even before the Golden Law. Ceará, in 1884, became the first Brazilian province to decree total abolition, an example that inspired other states and accelerated the inevitable collapse of the system at the national level. The growth of these campaigns was not well regarded by the slaveholding elite, which tried to discredit the abolitionists, accusing them of being naive idealists or of threatening social order. But popular pressure had already become irreversible. The country lived in a climate of change, in which slavery was no longer seen as a necessary evil, but as a national shame. However, it is worth remembering that these movements were, for the most part, led by middle and urban sectors, far from the reality of the coffee plantations. Although they were fundamental to the cause, they often did not directly represent the voice of the enslaved. Even so, their impact was decisive. They created the political and social environment that would make it impossible to maintain slavery for much longer. Thus, social movements and the press were the external engines that, added to the resistance of the enslaved themselves, pushed Brazil toward abolition. They showed that the country could no longer live with such a contradiction, seeking modernity and progress while keeping millions in chains. But despite all this pressure, Brazil would still resist for a few more years. Abolition would only come in 1888, and even then in a late, incomplete, and rushed way. In the next chapter, we will understand why the country was the last in the West to abolish slavery, and how the signing of the Golden Law revealed both the victory and the flaws of the abolitionist process. When we talk about the abolition of slavery in Brazil, many remember only May 13th, 1888, and the signing of the Golden Law by Princess Isabel. The official image is that of a noble gesture, celebrated with parties and applause. But the truth is that this moment, despite being symbolic, was marked by delay, unsustainable pressures, and serious omissions. Brazil was not only the last country in the West to abolish slavery, it was also the one that did so in the most rushed and incomplete way, as if it wanted to get rid of a burden without really resolving its consequences. The delay in abolition was the direct result of the resistance of the slaveholding elites. Large landowners and politicians linked to the coffee plantations feared that the freedom of the enslaved would mean the economic ruin of the country. For decades, they used their influence in Parliament to delay any significant change. The laws before abolition, such as the Free Womb Law of 1871, which freed only the children of enslaved women born from that date onward, and the Sexagenarian Law of 1885, which granted freedom to enslaved people over 60 years old, were palliative measures. They did not represent a commitment to freedom, but an attempt to prolong the system's life by granting partial freedoms that changed little in reality. Another factor that explains the delay is institutionalized racism. Many leaders believed that black people were not ready for freedom and that without slavery there would be social chaos. This discourse, used as justification, hid the real fear of the elite, losing control over a mass of millions of people who until then had been subjugated. Thus, abolition was postponed while Brazil watched the world move forward. However, in the 1880s, the scenario became unsustainable. External pressures intensified. Internally, the abolitionist movements gained strength and spread across the country. Enslaved people fled en masse, quilombos grew, cities declared themselves free. The system was collapsing, not by the will of the elite, but because it had become impossible to maintain. Abolition ceased to be a political choice and became a historical necessity. When the Golden Law was finally signed in 1888, the process was quick and almost without parliamentary debate. 2 articles only, one declaring slavery extinguished and another revoking contrary provisions. There was no plan for social inclusion, no land distribution, no reparations. No public policy was created to integrate the formerly enslaved into society. The country freed millions of people, but left them to their own fate, without jobs, without homes, without rights. This rush to officially end slavery without facing its consequences reveals the Brazilian contradiction. It was as if the elite wanted to erase centuries of exploitation with a single gesture, freeing itself from internal and external pressure, but without committing to justice. The signature of Princess Isabel was exalted as a heroic act, but in practice it also marked the perpetuation of an inequality that would cross generations. Brazil was the last country in the West to abolish slavery because its elite chose profit and power instead of human dignity. The delay was not by chance, but the result of a conscious decision to prolong exploitation to the limit. And when freedom finally came, it arrived without reparations, without opportunities, and without support. A freedom granted, but not built. Thus, May 13th of 1888 must be remembered not only as the day of abolition, but also as the day Brazil confirmed its backwardness before the world. A backwardness that left deep scars as millions of freed people were pushed to the margins of society, carrying the weight of an incomplete freedom. And it is precisely at this point that the most painful truth is revealed: what happened to the formerly enslaved after abolition. In the next chapter, we will understand how the late and incomplete end of slavery generated devastating social consequences that still echo to this day. The signing of the Golden Law on May 13th, 1888, is often remembered as a moment of glory, but in reality, it was also the beginning of one of the most painful chapters in Brazilian history. Slavery had officially ended, but the freedom granted was not accompanied by reparations, planning, or public policies. Millions of people were released from captivity only to be thrown into a society that offered them no space, dignity, or opportunities. This void left deep marks that shaped the inequality and structural racism that persist to this day. The first impact was abandonment. Unlike other countries that implemented integration programs or compensation, Brazil offered nothing to the formerly enslaved. Without land, without resources, and without state support, they were forced to live in precarious conditions. Many remained on the same plantations where they had worked their entire lives, now receiving miserable wages or simply being exploited under new forms of servitude. Formal freedom did not translate into real autonomy. This abandonment forced thousands to migrate to the cities. Without access to decent housing, they ended up forming the first nuclei of favelas on hillsides and in areas far from urban centers. These communities were born out of exclusion, the absence of housing policies, and the racism that prevented black people from occupying central spaces. Thus, spatial segregation became yet another reflection of incomplete abolition. In the labor market, the situation was no different. Many former slaveholders began to prefer European immigrants to replace the workforce. They believed these workers were more civilized and suited for progress. This preference was not only economic, but also racial. There was a deliberate attempt to whiten the population and reduce the black presence in spaces of power. As a result, the formerly enslaved were pushed into the heaviest, worst paid, and most devalued jobs. Institutional racism also consolidated. Even after abolition, laws and social practices discriminated against black people. Police repressed cultural manifestations of African origin, such as capoeira and drumming, treating them as crimes. African-based religions were persecuted. Skin color continued to determine who had access to opportunities, education, and respect. Slavery had ended on paper, but prejudice remained alive, now disguised in new forms of exclusion. This context produced consequences that crossed generations. Without land, without education, and without access to decent jobs, the descendants of the enslaved were condemned to social marginalization. While the white elite consolidated its economic and political power, the black population was left on the margins, reinforcing a cycle of poverty and inequality. This legacy is what we now call structural racism, a system that no longer needs visible chains to keep millions of people trapped in exclusion. Furthermore, the delay in abolition reinforced the stigma that black people were inferior or incapable of participating in society on equal terms. This racist imagination was perpetuated in schools, newspapers, and even in popular culture, normalizing the idea that inequality was natural. In practice, Brazil never reconciled with the fact that it was the last country in the West to abolish slavery, and this denial prevented the creation of real mechanisms of reparation. The consequences of this process are still visible today. The highest rates of poverty, violence, and social exclusion fall on the black population. The lack of representation in leadership positions, wage inequality, and everyday prejudice are direct legacies of an incomplete abolition. May 13th freed millions, but also condemned them to carry the weight of a freedom without support. That is why, when we look at history, we cannot see abolition only as a full stop. It was, in fact, a comma. It formally ended a brutal system, but left open wounds that were never healed. Brazil abolished slavery late, incompletely, and without repairing the damage caused. This deliberate choice created a historical debt that still needs to be recognized and confronted. And it is precisely at this point that we reach the final reflection. If abolition was late and incomplete, what does it teach us today? In the next chapter, we will look at this dark legacy and understand why knowing this truth is not only revisiting the past, but also a way to transform the present and the future. The history of slavery in Brazil cannot be summed up only by the date of May 13th, 1888. That day marked the official end of a brutal regime, but also revealed the negligence of a country that refused to offer reparation, inclusion, and justice to millions of freed people. Therefore, abolition must be understood not as an act of benevolence by the elite, but as a conquest wrested by the resistance of the enslaved, by popular mobilization, and by pressures that became impossible to ignore. Understanding this dark truth is essential to understanding Brazil today. Structural racism, social inequality, and the marginalization of entire communities were not born by chance. They are direct fruits of a late and incomplete abolition. To ignore this legacy is to perpetuate exclusion. To recognize it, on the other hand, is the first step toward building a different future, where freedom also means dignity, opportunity, and justice. This story is hard, but it must be told. Every broken chain, every quilombo formed, every voice that rose against oppression helped pave the way to freedom. To honor this struggle means not only remembering the past, but acting in the present. It means demanding policies that reduce inequalities, fighting prejudice in all its forms, and ensuring that future generations do not inherit the same scars. And that is why this video is more than a history lesson. It is an invitation to awareness. If you believe this message needs to reach more people, like this video, share it and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can echo this truth so that silence will never again try to erase the suffering and resistance of millions of Brazilians.